Hi, everybody. I'm Ralph Ben Murgy. Welcome to Not That Kind of Rabbi. To clarify for the 37th time, I'm not actually a rabbi. I am an ordained spiritual counselor, but I'm not an actual rabbi. But if I was a rabbi, I wouldn't be that kind of rabbi. So that's as far as I want to clarify that. Had some great people on lately, really been enjoying myself. And for some reason, I've gotten myself into a Jewish groove. I mean, this show isn't about being Jewish. This is a show about people's spirituality and about their journey and all the rest of it. But it's not about being Jewish. And yet, you know, what it was the high holidays, as we call them, the membership drive high holidays of any decent retail synagogue. But they are important and meaningful holidays if you treat them as such. So the Jewish New Year and the Day of Atonement, which are kind of bookends to a journey of self-reflection and what we call vidui, where you really take stock of yourself. And you have to figure out, you know, who do you love and what are you proud of? What do you regret? And what do you want to be remembered for? And there's one part where we talk about this notion of who will live and who will die. And a rabbi friend of mine in his sermon, his Devar Torah, during the holidays said, you know, there was a point in rabbinical school where I finally realized I was reading this wrong. It's not who will live and who will die. It's I will live and I will die. And I really love that because it was really about the renewal that we go through all the time, that there are versions of ourselves that we continually try to cling to and say, that's me. And then, you know, it's if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. And it's not you. You're not that person anymore. People don't see you that way. You stop seeing yourself that way. You go through something where you lose. There's grief. You know, the beautiful line, the price of love is grief. And you lose people and you have to go through that mourning for them. But we also do it with ourselves. We lose this. As we get older, we start to think of ourselves differently. The thing that was easy to do is no longer easy to do. The thing that we wanted to do is no longer the thing we want to do. I was talking to my neighbor yesterday. He's a lovely man, and I wanted to give him, my wife and I wanted to give him a bottle of rum because he occasionally has a shot of rum. So I gave it to him and he said, you know, when I was in my mid 40s and 50s and still teaching full time, I'd come home and I'd have a sizable shot of this stuff. And, you know, maybe later in the evening, I might even have a little more just to keep the stress down. He said, now I nurse a little shot of it for 2 hours. And sometimes there's still something left in the bottom. And I love that because it was about, he had to come to terms with, I'm not that guy. So he lives and he dies, and so do the rest of us. So that was a very cathartic experience for me. And I ended up with two different interviews with people who were Jewish. And today I'm going to make it three. So I'm on a roll. There's no doubt about that. But even within that, there are so many shades, you know. I put out a tweet a little while ago where I said something that a rabbi told me in my training once, which I loved, which was, God's not Jewish. We're Jewish. And that takes all the exceptionalism out of it, because I wrote in the blog on my Facebook page for Not That Kind of Rabbi that in a lot of orthodoxies in religions, be it Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, whatever, the orthodox error of that, there's this notion of exceptionalism. We weaponize our spirituality. We are the chosen people. You know, this is dangerous talk when you're trying to talk about unifying people as human beings, as mensches. You know, in a native tradition, that is the highest compliment. In the Jewish tradition, it's the highest compliment to call someone a human being. It's a process. You don't just have it because you're born human. You've got to become something. And I love all that. So I'm really been mushing that stuff around with this dangerous notion that's really surfaced for quite a while now. And I believe out of fear that we have to really dig in and really just say who we are and that other people aren't us, and that we've got to do something to make sure that us survives. I think the whole movement of Proud Boys and all of that is a terrified white Christian nation. And there was a black moderator of a program during the last presidential election who said it perfectly for me. He had a man on who was a white supremacist who was trying to pretend he wasn't a white supremacist. And it was a black host. And the host said to him at one point, he was a very fast talking host. He was very interesting. But he interrupts him and goes, excuse me. Here's what I think's going on here. You used to have an 80-yard head start, and now it's only 30 yards, and you're seriously pissed off about it. And the guy just looked at him and had nothing to say, because really it was about losing the privilege and the advantage. And that's the little thing that's going on right now. I think in some ways the American Civil War never ended. They just called a truce on one level of it and then revisited it and have been revisiting it over and over and over again. The Jim Crow laws, the voter suppression. In Texas right now, they're trying to do voter suppression. I mean, these things are real. And we as Canadians in this context are certainly not immune to them. But underneath it all, I wonder, where's the spiritual center for people? A non-weaponized spiritual center, one that allows people to see others as they see themselves, as sacred beings. I don't feel it. Even spirituality has become spiritual materialism. At best, you shop for God. Which God do I want? Do I want the one I don't have to do any rules to? Do I want a little Buddhism? Maybe I'll take a little of my original religion. Oh, look, that's interesting over there in the Hindu, So we kind of put this buffet out there, this Trader Vic's kind of religion. You go for the all you can eat and just a little of this, a little of that. And what the high holidays do for me is every year they kind of slap me around a bit and go, come on, pay attention. Just try to ground yourself in here, and then you can go running off in all directions badly, as they say. So those are some of my thoughts. There's somebody who has done a lot to, what should I say, preserve, encourage, promote Yiddish culture. And I have to say, Yiddish culture as a Jewish person for me is a pretty foreign idea, because I'm a North African Jew. I'm a Sephardic Jew, not an Ashkenazi Jew. When people say, what's Ashkenazi? I say, well, to a lot of people, it's Fiddler on the Roof. That's Ashkenazi Judaism to them. My Judaism, which is grounded in the Arab world, is an entirely interestingly different thing. Because when we came to Canada, Jewish people who we would meet, because only 3% of North American Jews are what I am, a Sephardic Jew, would say to my parents, you don't speak Yiddish? And God love my father for not turning around and going, well, it doesn't come in really handy in North Africa to speak Yiddish. It's not a great currency to have. But instead you go, no, actually, we speak Spanish. We're a little different. And that was that. But this man speaks Yiddish. And that's it for the interview. We're done.
That's it. Shalom Aleichem,
Yeah. So Michael Wex has written, how many books have you written so far? 7?
Written or published?
No, published.
Published 7 or 8.
Yeah. Rhapsody and Schmaltz is one.
That was the most recent, Rhapsody and Schmaltz.
And the one that catapulted you to the top of the bestsellers list was Born to Kvetch.
Born to Kvetch, that's right.
Kvetch is complaining, I guess.
Yeah.
How are you, Mr. Wex?
I'm well, thank you, Ralph. It's good to see you and to be here. I found the high holidays a little weirder this year than normal, as I'm not technically a member of any synagogue, although I do, especially on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I always go. But of course, with social distancing, etc., and limitations on numbers, I was completely shut out. So I basically spent them at home, davening, going through all the prayers, etc. And I came from an Orthodox family, so I know what you're not supposed to do unless you have 10 people there,
Right.
etc. And it's remarkable how you can cram a full day's synagogue attendance into about 60 minutes without actually skipping anything and taking your time at it. It's really quite staggering.
But so you do show up usually on high holidays. What compels you to go to synagogue if the rest of the year you don't?
I think that's mostly the rather self-absorbed idea that I'll be even more uncomfortable not going than I would be if I went. It would just be too weird.
Right.
And I once, through no fault of my own, was one previous time I was much younger, but I was actually unable to go one year. And I felt terrible just not being there. I was sick. I had a perfectly valid excuse.
Right.
I wasn't 100% bedridden, but I couldn't leave the house. And it was so depressing. I mean, it's like those things you read in the regular newspapers about people alone at Christmas time and they
Right.
have nobody. And it wasn't that I had nobody. It's just that you're not going to shul. We don't want anything to do with you. You know, you sort of took yourself out of that giant communal thing. Judaism is not really one of those religions that is heavily geared to solitude.
No.
There are some strains in it. There Breslov Hasidism, which encourages a certain amount of alone time with God on a daily basis. But again, that's, you have your hour with God, and the rest of it is you need 10 people to do just about anything. The
Which
idea
keeps the community together, right? I
yeah,
mean,
oh, absolutely.
it's the
It is a
quorum. Yeah.
communal, it's a communal thing.
And we're not a brick and mortar civilization because you're always on the move in
Yeah.
one way or another.
Yeah, no, not in the least. I mean, one of the amazing things that happened inside of Judaism was a couple of thousand years ago when the temple was destroyed. You had a shift in the whole way that the religion functioned. Because up until the destruction of the Second Temple, Judaism was completely place obsessed.
Yeah.
Where the whole thing was you not only have to go to Jerusalem, you have to go to the right part of Jerusalem where the temple is, and the sacrifices in that temple were probably 90% of the religion. And to rejig it after you no longer had that, at the time of the destruction of the temple, which is around the year 70, people seriously thought this religion was finished. They couldn't imagine how they're going to get around that, location centrism, if you want to call it that. And all the stuff that we've all been complaining about ever since. It's like, what do you mean I got to do this? A lot of that was deliberately put into place to substitute for the temple service. If you look in the Bible, it doesn't say go and daven, go and pray here, and you have to stand there and listen to a rabbi give a 3-hour speech. It says, you show up on this holiday with, 2 bullocks and a ram or something, and you hand them over, and that's what you need to do. And there was a hereditary priesthood that ran all of that.
And did it for you. Which sometimes in the modern era, I remember going to Ashkenazi synagogue as a kid regularly for Hebrew school and Saturday services. We didn't have a Sephardic Hebrew school in the early 60s. Right. So I went to Beth Shalom Synagogue in downtown Toronto. But the main sanctuary was a presentation. The cantor had an opera voice.
Yeah.
Everything was done for you. You just sat in the chair and had somebody perform. So it was to me, it's almost like an attempt to recreate that, don't worry, we'll do it for you kind of attitude.
Well, there is that. That's more, I think, in, I guess, less strictly Orthodox.
Yes.
Conservative, reform. I'm not putting them down. I'm just saying they're more influenced.
It was more of a big box kind of presentation.
Yeah.
Right?
There are some Orthodox synagogues like that too, but the smaller ones, which are the ones that I grew up in, if you had a rabbi on premises or who was hired, you were doing well. Quite often the person leading the services was just whoever bullied their way up to the front. The guy with the sharpest elbows would usually win.
Hit the bima.
Yeah.
Let me ask you something.
It was a little different.
I want to ask you, so
sure.
Sometimes I just go back to first principles. And in this case, when you say God, what does that mean to you, that word?
It's the kind of question I dread because I have no answer. Maimonides, who was a great Moroccan himself via Spain, he said, you can't even imagine God. All you can do is, if you say you can say positive things about God, but only to avoid saying negative things. There's no way. God is so far above the human that we just can't perceive what, you can't even say what it might be. There's no qualities there that we have the intellectual or emotional capacity even to perceive, let alone to understand.
But is there a basic premise that there is an intentional
creative
absolutely. Force in the universe? Totally. And you believe that?
Yeah, I guess. Particularly every time
there's people who think it's random.
No, look, every time I cough during a pandemic, my faith index goes up a little bit. I think my father used to joke, you could tell, especially going by non-Orthodox synagogues on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, especially on Yom Kippur, he would look at the parking lots, and the fuller the parking lot was, the worse business was that year. The emptier the parking lot is, you didn't need God. You could go to work and make money or whatever. And people got scared. They would revert back.
But there are people who argue that's the problem, is that it's, no atheist in a foxhole. But if you don't happen to be in the foxhole, who cares? You can just go about your business.
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily the right way to run your life, but I think it's pretty common, particularly, outside of faith communities of whatever religion, where people perform different whatever religious rituals as a matter of course, as a matter of their day-to-day lives. This is what happened with Judaism, is especially over here, that is in North America, in Western Europe after a while, starting, I guess, in Germany, you came more and more to the church of your choice, go once a week model. Whereas previously, it had just been like this all-encompassing total way of life. When I was a kid, because I grew up speaking Yiddish at home, I could read like Yiddish books. And I'd read these Yiddish novels about, Jewish criminals in the old country. And there's a lot of these books. There was a large Jewish criminal class. But in the books, I couldn't get it. These guys, gang of thieves, they get up in the morning. What is the first thing they do? They wash their hands in a ritual manner, put on their prayer shawl and phylacteries, and they daven, they pray. Then they take off the prayer shawl, they take off the phylacteries, they have something to eat, and they go out and steal a few horses or beat a few people up until it's time for the afternoon prayer service, when they stop doing all of that, daven, and go back to being criminals. I couldn't figure it out for years. It's like, what kind of hypocrites are these people?
All I'm thinking about is The Godfather, and the scene in Godfather 2 with the Mass and the Catholic Church, and the people, all the leaders of the different families getting killed by
at the end of one, during the baptism.
And there's faith is located in loyalty to family, not in universal ideas of compassion and kindness.
Yeah, and I guess what I was talking about was more, it's why did they do all this stuff? They would only eat kosher food.
So why did they?
Because that's what a Jew did. That was like how you lived if you were Jewish. If you didn't do that, and this is a while ago anyway, 19th century, early 20th century, if you didn't do that, particularly in Eastern Europe, you removed yourself from the larger community and you were nowhere. There was no question at the time, like here in the cultural milieu in which we live and which was more common in Western Europe, it's really easy to assimilate, right? I can stop keeping kosher. I can stop going to the synagogue. I don't have to fast on Yom Kippur, and nobody cares. I'm still considered Jewish, but I can blend in.
Yeah.
You couldn't blend in
right.
Poland, Russia, Romania,
Ukraine.
Hungary,
Yeah.
wherever at the time. Without, the only way you could bend in was actually converting to
or going into
religion.
the larger urban centers, because by the turn of the century, Warsaw, Krakow, places like that, German Berlin, people could
Berlin
get
more
into power circles.
Because you got to remember, until the Russian Revolution, Jews in the Russian Empire, which includes most of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, etc., they didn't have full civil rights, which they did in Austro-Hungary,
right,
to a much larger degree anyway, and especially in places that now, like Vienna or Hungary, particularly, places like Budapest, where they could kind of function in the larger society. It was much more difficult.
Let me ask you this: do you think that the Jewish psyche, the intergenerational trauma, the Jewish psyche, do you think that there will always be a thing about imminent danger?
Yeah, I think it's, at this point, I think partly it's just built in, to the psyche because of various things that have happened. Partly because, if you have any connection with the traditional, and I'm using that in a very wide sense, traditional modes of Jewish thought, is, the central event is the destruction of the temple. The fact that, we're living in a world where we have lost something that no matter what we do, we ourselves are not capable of restoring. There's not supposed to be a temple, sacrifices, the ingathering of the exiles. That's only going to happen when the Messiah comes.
Which dovetails, unfortunately, with the evangelical prophecies of the return of Jews to start the tribulations into the apocalypse, because then their Messiah comes back.
But their Messiah is going to get all of us to convert to Christianity, and those of us who say no are cast into everlasting fire.
So I can start to eat shellfish, is what you're going to tell me.
Well, you could. Look, according to the New Testament, this guy, somebody appears to St. Peter in a dream with like a poo-poo platter and says, no. And St. Peter says, yeah, but it's treif. It's not kosher. And what does he say to Peter? He says, take and eat.
Right. Which to me is one of the things that I grew up kosher. I'm vegetarian now, so it's moot, but I grew up kosher. And to me, I always had this little thing in me that said, I'm giving part of the planet a break here. Like there's all these things I can't eat, so they don't need to be killed for my edification. All these shellfish, pork, I can't do milk and meat together. Every restaurant you go into, all there is milk and meat and everything, so I won't have all those things. I'll have the salad. I'm good. So there's this sense of restraint, which also comes up in the fasting days in the religion.
Yeah.
And in all religions, there's always this sense of restraint.
Yeah, because the ultimate idea here, and this also is Maimonides, he says, like, what the proper attitude is not like, ew, he's eating bacon, that's a ham sandwich. Fair, horrible. What a terrible thing. I would never touch that. This, according to Maimonides, this is low level. This is, you're Homer Simpson if you think like this. The idea is you're supposed to look at it and go like, man, that looks great. I really, really want that. But my Father in heaven says no. And that's more important to me. Doing the will of the being that has brought me into being is more important than immediate satisfaction of my own desires, no matter how powerful that desire.
So Ramadan, 40 days of restraint during the day between sunset and sunrise. It's a beautiful thing.
Well, that's
and yet
a long
our
fast.
society is so not interested in restraint. It's almost beyond comprehension. Like, look at this pandemic. You're not, screw you. Nobody tells me what to do.
Yeah, well, I
don't need this mask. I'm better than science, which is also the climate crisis. I'm better than that.
Yeah.
And there's this, I always feel that we're in a situation where we have created for ourselves a sense of our own, and I don't mean this in the right way, in the wrong way, godliness, that we are God, and that this place is to serve us until it's finished. And we will overcome everything because we are gods. We now walk the earth and reimagine it in our own image as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, I don't even think it's we're gods. I think it's I'm God.
That's what I mean.
I am like God, and you're shit.
Yeah, I am God.
You don't matter, though. That's the most.
Well, look at the narcissism of the president of the United States. I am God. Well,
that's it's
only I can solve this.
What was that Chris Christopherson song? Jesus was a Capricorn.
Oh yeah.
It says, everybody's got to have somebody to look down on. That's pretty much it. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I'm worried. Like, is that where we're at?
It seems to be. I don't know if it's any worse than it ever was.
Right.
But of course, the possibilities of disseminating it are a lot better than they used to be.
And the technologies to do something vile about it are much more comprehensive.
Yeah, that's basically what I meant.
Yeah. So we're in that, but you got to wonder. So when you work as hard as you do to keep alive a language and a culture, the Yiddish culture and Yiddishkeit, as it's called, I say to people occasionally that being a Jew is kind of an act of spite. Right? It's just like, you're not, first of all, I'm not going to just drop the ball now after all this. And secondly, you can't tell us that we don't have a right to exist. Is that part of what animates your passion for the culture?
Partly. Well, it was mostly my fear, not that I have any exalted notions of what I can do, but after about 1,000 years, this thing was starting, this thing like Yiddish was starting to go away. It was vanishing. And at least for those of us, from an Ashkenazi background, this is this is what determined really who we, that is Ashkenazim, who we are and how we think, so much of, and I know this bugs the hell out of people who aren't Ashkenazim, that, ideas of what is Jewish humor or Jewish food, Jewish this, Jewish that is basically what they mean is Ashkenazi.
Yeah, in North America, yes.
Yeah, it's not a universal thing. It's not uniform across the Jewish world. And in fact, there is much more variation between or among the different non-Ashkenazi Jewish communities, even inside. Sephardim in Yugoslavia live very differently from Sephardim in Morocco.
Right.
Or something. Whereas Ashkenazi culture, there were differences, but basically starting in France and moving all the way into Russia, you had, it was one large cultural unit. There were certainly regional variations. and stuff. But, the language, the way of thinking, the kinds of educational system that had sprung up were pretty much the same.
Tell me about the way of thinking part, because, there are all these phrases in Yiddish that really a person would have to really unpack because they don't seem to make any sense.
Yeah.
The parody of it would be, don't touch a chicken with butter,
Right.
put your spoon in a hat, and I always think, what are these people talking about? But
don't knock me a tea kettle.
I was going to try it. All I got was don't hakman chainik. Is that even close to being correct?
It's close.
I missed a few words in there. I mean, look, the other part of this is, as somebody who's not from that, there's a Jewish festival in Toronto, the Ashkenaz Festival, and I always took great offense to that. I remember
I was the one who named it.
Yeah, well, I took great offense because for me it was like, oh, I see. That's what being Jewish is. Jewish music is Ashkenazi
well, you see, it was
music.
supposed to be Yiddish. You see, the idea was it was a festival of Yiddish music and culture, at least to start with.
Well, it certainly never grew into that.
And that's what it was, at least for a good few years.
Yeah, but for us, you got to know that for us, we came to Canada and we were invisible. Now, in later years, I really appreciated that because seriously, because in Israel, we were not invisible. We were just the lower class. We were the pawn scum of Judaism, straightening our hair and pretending we were white and doing all those things for the edification of the Eastern Europeans who ran Israel. It was their idea, not ours.
Yeah.
We were just livestock. You could fit in there. But here, nobody knew who we were. We were never invited to be in any associations or do anything with the rest of the Jewish community. But it was in many ways a bit of a godsend because it wasn't the same prejudice that my relatives in Israel were suffering when they left Morocco in exile. So
yeah,
it's an interesting, I did a panel once at Ashkenaz of Sephardic performers who were talking about their experience of being Sephardic Jews in Israel. And they're the ones who had stories about running to the radio, running home ahead of their friends to make sure their mother turned off the radio before their friends arrived because the mother was playing Arabic music on the radio because that's where she was from. And of straightening their hair because there were too many kinks in their hair, right? Because they had Arab blood in them the way Eastern Europeans have Christian blood in them, So it's very interesting.
Israel also, for the longest time had a very negative attitude towards Yiddish.
Yes, wasn't Ben Gurion that it was the slave language and we don't want to keep
pretty much, yeah. And a guy like one of the big Israeli Yiddish comedians who'd come after the war from Poland and from some time in the Gulag as well, Shimon Jigan, who, if you were like a Jew from Poland in the 30s, he was kind of, the Bob Hope of that era. I mean, that's how well known he was. He had to go on, he staged a hunger strike. This is in the late 60s, I believe, in order to be allowed on Israeli television, or in order to be allowed to speak Yiddish on Israeli television.
Wow.
And, there's all these stories about people walking down the street speaking Yiddish, and people would just yell at them, Goy daber ivrit, Goy, speak Hebrew.
Right. That's like Quebec with French people going into Eaton's or Simpson's and being told speak white.
Right. But there was that extreme shlilut hagolah, dissolution of the diaspora mentality in Israel that operated in both directions, towards Ashkenazim and Sephardim. Of course, it was being run for the most part by Ashkenazim.
Yeah.
90% anyway. No question about that. But again, the importance of Yiddish to that culture, though, was such, again, you say, how can you be Jewish if you don't speak Yiddish?
Yeah.
You read things like, Primo Levi's memoirs about, being in Auschwitz, and he talks about like Greek Jews coming in, being shipped in and not lasting, very long because they couldn't speak Yiddish. And Yiddish was, of course, the lingua franca of the concentration camps, amongst the prisoners,
Right.
just because of who was there. The inability to speak Yiddish could have cost you your life. And there were cases later in the war when the Nazis began deporting people from Hungary, which didn't start happening until, I think, 1944. Much of the Hungarian Jewish community by that point had assimilated to a considerable degree. And even many of the more Orthodox people had assimilated linguistically. So they spoke Hungarian rather than Yiddish. And off the top of my head, I can count a dozen people that I know of Hungarian Jewish background whose parents, particularly their mothers, learned Yiddish in concentration camps rather than at home before the war. And I know
For survival.
And most of the people I'm talking about are also like extremely, extremely religious, either Chassidim or very close to it. And most of the people I know my age, baby boomers, many of them grew up speaking Yiddish with their fathers and Hungarian with their mothers, because their mothers were still more comfortable in Hungarian if they had fathers who had been that Orthodox before the war. So the fathers would have studied in yeshivas, in traditional schools, where in a lot of cases the language of instruction was still Yiddish.
So let me ask you something. What would happen if Judaism withered on the vine and disappeared?
Yeah.
Would the world be any worse off?
Yeah, but it might not know that.
In what way would it be worse?
It might not. I think some of the general cultural contribution. First, I think of any group with certain political exceptions were to vanish off the earth, everybody is going to be impoverished to some degree. Again, whether they're aware of it or they're not aware of it. But you look at some of the ideas that have come in, they've basically become mainstream more through Christian adaptations of them. But the whole morality that we at least pretend to believe in and to uphold basically comes out of the Old Testament. Much of that peculiar Jewish way of thinking, which ultimately, and it's pretty ultimate in most cases these days, but ultimately grows out of a Talmudic mindset. The kind of approach to problems, to solving a problem, that you'll find in the Gemara, in the Talmud, which is not necessarily, you don't go A to B. You go like A to Q, and then maybe back to L, right, which reminds you of Z, which takes you to C, but then what about D? Eventually you get to B. But it's not always the straightest line, because the straightest line, the shortest distance between 2 points, is not necessarily the best way to go, right, always. And I think you'd miss a lot of that. That would, I don't want to go through one of those, well, if you don't like Jewish people, you should stop doing this and stop doing that because that was invented by a Jew.
Right. That's the exceptionalism argument. Yeah.
And that's great that there's all these, Jewish Nobel Prize winners.
That's always the argument.
And
per capita.
Yeah, where would we be without Al Jolson?
Yeah. Well,
you can see it in Germany, and I'm talking now, contemporary Germany, Poland, places like that, particularly post-Warsaw Pact, where there is this, relatively large interest in Jews and Judaism on the part of people who are not themselves Jewish, people from those places who sort of, realizing what had happened during World War II and how many Jews there had been, particularly in places like Poland. They get into it, they start looking into it, and they themselves, as non-Jewish Poles or Germans or Romanians or Hungarians, say, our culture, just the general culture of the place has lost so much with the loss of the Jewish population.
And then you have Americans at a race conflagration mess riot, who white supremacists saying Jews will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. You have Henry Ford, who believed that jazz was the invention of Jews manipulating African Americans to take over the country. And Ford, what he did in response is he created square dancing associations. And if you think about it, there's nothing more white Christian than square dancing.
There's a reason they call it square,
Yeah, 37 states still have as their official dance square dancing, because he poured tons of money into that. I mean, and yet, there's the Gru subway station in Montreal about a cleric who was anti-Semitic.
Oh, yeah.
So these,
well, this is again where
it's a tough one, because you don't want to end up defensive and saying they're out to get us, but it's
one of the great things about Judaism in general is almost any theory about anything that anybody has ever come up with falls apart when you try and apply it to the Jews. It seems to be the outward limit of where general rules apply.
Give me an example of that.
Something like, okay, we all need to be sensitive to everybody, and I'm fine with that. People want to choose their pronouns, et cetera, et cetera. It was you're mentioning Lionel Gru that reminded me of this. I myself, I guess churches scare me. I've been inside them, generally unwillingly, and very rarely for a religious service, but I have. The idea that, there are certain things you shouldn't say, you shouldn't do in public, you got to watch out for other people. I mean, if I were to say that, I find the fundamental notions of Christianity abhorrent, and I don't want to have to hear them or see them or look at them, and I don't think they should have crosses on display where they can be seen in public, people would think that I was insane, and I probably would be. The idea that, but when you start canceling things and people, look at the history of Western culture. You're going to cancel everybody who ever said anything bad about the Jews. You're not going to have very much left. I'm serious, I was, my actual education in grad school had nothing to do with any of the things we're talking about. I was a medievalist doing non-Jewish medieval literature. And one of the reasons I couldn't take it anymore after a while, because just the gratuitous anti-Semitism that would sometimes come up in things is you're reading something and, okay, this is all right. And the guy is talking about whatever. And then, by the way, fuck the Jews, and then keep going. And it's wait, so I'm spending my life making these guys look good.
Right.
And they wouldn't even have considered me human.
Right. What an odd thing we do to each other.
But, and again, many of these are worth, you take that little bit out, and these are people with some, who did something very worthwhile.
Okay, so here's the tougher one. I'll give you a tougher one. You get a country, finally. Next year in Jerusalem, which you say every year in the holidays, is actually true. You're there. You have a wall, even
Wow.
that you can worship at.
Oh, that wall, right?
Or worship at. And then there's another wall to make sure nobody gets into that wall anymore.
Wow.
But then I always remember Gwynne Dyer, who's one of my favorite commentators. Right. Dyer did a series called War for the CBC years ago. That. It was fantastic. I wish I could find it again. But at one point, he's in the northern part near the Golan, and he's in Israel, and he says, the problem with getting a state is that if you really want to keep it, you have to be willing to kill other people.
Yeah.
And he had a very dry way of saying that, but it was very true. And now we see ourselves in a different way through this country that is there. And the diaspora gives you a certain gift of grafting yourself onto different civilizations and cultures and being enriched by them as a nomadic people. But now it's about the root and the planting of the flag and the protection of the people and the exceptionalism and the movement away from others and the oppression and all the pieces that you're so amazed that this is where it's at. So is it be careful what you wish for? Is that where we're at?
I think to a large degree, yeah. And I think also, there's a reason, and a very strong reason, that so much of the Jewish world was pre-World War II not all that keen on political Zionism. It was a popular movement, but it was by no means universal. And of course, the two extremes that rejected it most conclusively were, the extreme left, where, it's Communist Party kind of, workers of all countries belong together. Right. National boundaries like this are crap, and it's just a class thing. And the ultra orthodox, who basically thought this is pushing what should be a messianic possession is the wrong word. This is you're anticipating something that you don't actually have the power to bring about. That is the redemption.
Right.
And, even mainstream, middle of the road Zionist orthodoxy wrestled with this for a long time. The prayer for the state of Israel that you'll hear in most synagogues, it starts off, Reishit smichat gulateinu, the beginning of the blossoming or sprouting of our redemption. That is, this is the prelude,
right,
to redemption. Like, even they don't actually go so far as to say, we're here, we're staying, get used to it.
Right. Right.
I think things have moved well to the right in practice since that prayer was written, and it's.
So, is it a gift or is it a curse or is it both?
I think it's what you said. Be careful what you wish for. Certainly there was a diaspora nationalist movement, and there still is, but it was at one time much stronger. And the whole idea, you get this especially, particularly with the left wing of the Yiddish world, of what's called Duikheit, here-ness. That is, we're going to make a Jewish life in the country in which we find ourselves. And this made a lot more sense before 1939 or before 1933 than it does, subsequently. In that you could at least convince yourself that you were able to do that. I think the one thing that we've all walked away with, and not just Jews, from the Holocaust, is this can happen to anybody, anywhere, anytime. Nobody needs a good reason to do it, and nobody's going to help you, depending on who you are. And we've seen it in our own lifetimes.
Sure, Rwanda, Cambodia.
Rwanda, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the same examples. Pardon me, the same examples exactly that I would have given. It's going on now. What's happening in parts of China
The Uyghurs.
with the Uyghurs, yeah. And
Yeah.
what's anybody doing? Oh, isn't that terrible? I'll check what I buy at the dollar store to make sure it wasn't made in China. I don't know.
Well, there's there's the old piece of the guy sitting on the bench with Jesus and saying, how could you let these things happen? God, how could you actually let a Holocaust happen? How can you let people attack each other and do all these awful things? And Jesus says, it's funny. I was just about to ask you the same question.
Yeah.
Because, it's us, really.
Yeah,
it's us and our fallibility and our fear and scarcity drives of some sort or another is the driving motivation, coupled with nonstop consumption, which also animates inadequacy. The only way you can sell somebody something is if they don't have enough. That car's not quite the right car. You need this car, right? So when you do stuff like that, you end up with people afraid that they're never going to have enough, and moving away from the gratitude and the wonder and awe of a spiritual life into a life that is much more about stuff. I mean, one of the largest businesses in North America is storage, right? Storage, for God's sake. That's how ridiculous we've become.
Yeah, no, and this, I think to go back to what you were saying about, the situation in Israel or the Middle East in general is, it's a no-win situation in many ways, in that no side is completely willing to acknowledge the claims, the rights, the pretensions, whatever, of the other one. And as long as you have that kind of impasse, it's not insane for an Israeli to say, I'm afraid that, if things shift only very slightly, we will all be murdered or driven into the sea. Because there are certainly people that are prepared to and would be happy to do that. On the other hand, you have a whole lot of people who need places to live, and I'm pretty sure, I don't like to speak for anybody, but I'm pretty sure that most of the people who have been displaced, who are now living, having to go through checkpoints, there are all these Palestinians. I'm sure most of them would just like to have the kind of lives that any regular person in any regular place has, and to be assured of some
Everybody
security
would like
that nobody's going to come and kick you out.
Right.
Nobody's going to, force you to move or destroy your house, whatever.
Right. So I have a on Prime right now, a series I did a few years back called My Israel. And I spoke to everybody I could. And when I got on the plane after 2.5 weeks of shooting, I got on the plane. And what occurred to me was two things. One is no one feels heard. I don't care what side of it you're on, you don't feel heard. There's no sense of dignity, that others are treating you with dignity. No matter who you were, there was this victimhood that was permeating every culture in the area. And that we really aren't learning anything by doing this exercise of nationalism. We're really finding ourselves with, when you consider that not to go too far into it, but the Middle East itself is a completely colonial construct of made up countries from colonial powers. And then all of a sudden you're a Jordanian, and all of a sudden you're a Saudi when there was no such thing, or the Iraq of the world, that were really totally different constructions under their own, or under Ottoman steam, I should say.
Yeah, well,
so all of that, and I want to put one more layer on that, which is we have enough to worry about in this country alone with our treatment of indigenous people. That the idea that we can get on a high horse and talk about what rights other people should and shouldn't have and who's violating them, when the suicide rate for teen indigenous people is 5 times the rate of other Canadians, where they don't live as long, where they're beset with poverty, undrinkable water, racism. And yet here we are going, I think we need to be treated better. Just think, oh my God, what do you mean we need to be treated better? We
No,
couldn't
no,
be better off at this point. And we intermarry and we do whatever we
we
want.
do what we want. Look, I mean, I think part of the panic that's seized the whole middle class in the past few years, especially since the 2016 elections in the U.S., is that all of a sudden, all that stuff that we've got that we took for granted, and in many cases treated with, more than a little bit of contempt, we're suddenly in real danger of losing. And not just, white privilege, just the whole, any kind of privilege, the whole way of life. We've finally seen just how precarious it is that one idiot in the right place can basically destroy a world. And this is an ancient Jewish idea that, you need to watch out for that sort of thing. And, again, when people deal with each other, and before I came on here today, I listened to your last podcast with Sharon Green, with whom I actually shared an office at one time.
Oh, cool.
At the U of T. But
Come Back for Me is the name of her book.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But you guys were talking about Martin Buber.
Right.
And I and thou. And yeah, the minute you start treating somebody like an it, like a member of a group that, you might not like, or you might like that group. Right. But the minute you stop treating people as sacred individuals with the same feelings and the same rights and the same problems as you, even though they might be on the other end of that problem, it becomes a lot harder to treat them badly.
Yeah.
But as long as it's like just some, the Jews should know better, and the Jews blah, 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 and what, as if, the Nazis were there to provide us with some kind of moral lesson.
Right.
And on the other side, I'm not talking to him, what do I need to talk to that Arab for?
Right.
He's an Arab. Well, yeah, you're going to get absolutely nowhere.
So are you hopeful in the end? Are you actually, as we get older?
As we get older, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I sometimes, as I get older, I understand now why the Council of Old People, which I mocked and laughed at for a good 40 years, was so valued in just about every culture that I know anything about. It's because eventually, as you confront, the inevitable end to which we're all going to come, you get a much more pointed idea of what's important and what isn't. And it's unfortunately very often difficult to get that across, either to younger people or to people who just don't want to look at it that way, that, really a lot of this is completely self-defeating, and it benefits only the people who have put themselves in a position to benefit from others being in a position of strife or in a relationship of strife.
Right. So we live in an environment here of extractive capitalism, that you must extract resources at maximum profit, and you must suppress wage demands from people and extract the most labor from them for the lowest price.
Well, when you have a right wing that considers Eisenhower's social policies to be tantamount to communism or socialism, you've got a problem. He just wasn't that big a liberal.
Yeah. Yes, but he was aware of the military-industrial complex, which to this day runs America. I think there's been 9 years in their history where they haven't been at war with someone.
And again, one of the tragedies of our own youth is we were all so busy, stopping Vietnam, whether we lived in the U.S. or not, and getting stoned and smiling on our brother, that we didn't notice that at least up until that point, those years were the years of the greatest buildup of nuclear arms in American history. And we were all too distracted
Well, I
Uh,
wouldn't be so hard on that. I think that it was an honest striving to release a generation which had a majority of the demographic at that point that was under 25. It's from this idea of falling into this meaningless material pursuit where they tried to be communal, where they tried to think of more universal ideas, where they tried to think of love, where they tried to do this. And there was a huge backlash to this idea. Once the white middle class, a young person, was being told they were going to go to a war they weren't interested in fighting, they all rose up, but it
yeah,
all got lost. But I still think that there was a striving to recreate the American image into something more pastoral. The way in Israel, the original Zionist was a secular, and that the
yeah,
kibbutz and the labor movement and the social Zionism of the time was about sharing and caring for each other. And I have friends who still live on a kibbutz north of Tel Aviv, and we go to stay with them, and it's been privatized. I
yeah.
mean,
No, I
what
know.
the biggest thing they have is a water park. You see, that's their big money maker, and almost everybody works off the kibbutz now.
Yeah,
You can work there if you want, but there's always this thing of neoliberalism has had a profound effect, and the left and the right both have vacated the idea of a spiritual center, that there are
yeah. Well,
guiding
there's
principles in a spiritual life. So the I and thou is a sacred relationship of listening from my heart to your heart and back.
yeah, and
We've
there's
lost that. We talk
yeah.
from
Oh,
here.
totally. I hate to quote Saint Augustine about anything, but uh,
He had
he
some good
kind of
stuff.
divided human motivations into two large categories. Caritas, as he calls it in Latin, which is more like love, uh, closer to agape, and cupiditas, cupidity, greed, wanting stuff. It's
Right.
just, the constant I gotta have, I gotta have. And there's an old, anything by William Blake is old, but there's a William Blake picture uh, in one of his lesser works, as it's generally classified, called The Gates of Paradise, where it's somebody standing at the bottom of a ladder. The ladder reaches up into the sky. There's nothing holding it up. And the ladder is pointing up to the sky, and it's like a night sky, so you can see the stars. The ladder just, it ends, but it's standing on its own. And the caption is, I want, I want.
Right.
And that's, I think, what is kind of taken over. And without some kind of countervailing uh, ideology is the wrong word, but power or force, whether that is religion or a simple commitment to, some kind of ethics, that, something that is not, there was an old joke when I was a kid. I grew up in Alberta, in a smaller town, so I didn't have a
Lethbridge,
large
right?
Jewish, yeah, I didn't have a large Jewish community.
I
Uh,
always I always say about cities like that, another center of Yiddishkeit.
right. Well, hey, so where the last, Chava Rosenfarb, the last important Yiddish novelist, who had been living in Montreal after the war. She was from Poland, but she ended her life. She lived in Lethbridge for a number of
Wow.
years because
Wow.
her daughter teaches at the university there.
So it was a hotbed of
Lethbridge had
Yiddishkeit.
this weird kind of Yiddish fate. Yeah.
Yeah.
But people used to, it was a joke from people a generation older than us, who had all served in one way or another during World War II. That, the motto of the RCAF before they unified the forces was, per aspera ad astra. So through difficulties up to the stars. The popular translation of this was, I've got mine, so fuck you, Jack. And as long as that's your attitude, nobody's ever going to get anywhere because
Well,
everybody's
that's
too
what.
busy stabbing each other in the back.
Well, I spent a few years in retail politics, and the politician is constantly driven away from ideals to customer service
Yeah.
and short-term customer service. I mean, not to be too specific in terms of what I think happens to whom, but I would say that the last Liberal government had a leader in Kathleen Wynne who actually was talking about transportation plans, for instance, that were 15 years out that would have benefited everyone for 15 years. And people just said, I don't really give a crap about that. My hydro bill went up, even because it had been artificially suppressed for so many years. They thought it was outrageous.
Right.
And then they just thought, well, screw these people. They've had enough troubles. They're out because they're not giving me what I want. And we want more for less constantly. And it's making us more unhappy. This pandemic has been, in some ways, a curative, a bit of a slap in the back of the head of wake up.
Yeah.
I mean, the spiritual journey is, the spiritual journey is about waking up. That's the constant message of every religion. The shofar blowing, the ram's horn blowing at the holiday is literally to wake you up.
Yeah.
The Buddhist philosophy of enlightenment is to be awake, to be present in the moment. The Hindu Vedanta, this is the only thing that is real, this present moment. So when we talk about these things, we're not awake. We're somnambulists who just dream walking through this life. But all of a sudden, all of those things that had us driving from here to there to there to here, to see this, to do that, to get to this meeting, to go see the therapist, to get to the doctor, to find some groceries, all of a sudden it's over. It's a sham. I'm interviewing you. You didn't have to go anywhere. I didn't have to go anywhere. We're just talking to each other. And it's really, I'm very interested, because this is a long-term situation, about how we will come out the other end. Will we go running back to what we had? Is that what human nature has become? Or will we actually stop and look at it and go, I didn't need to live like that, and I don't need all this. I just want to be around people. I just want to be around this creation. I just want to be within it. My heart hopes it'll happen, but I worry for us. I as I get older, I deeply worry for us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know, obviously. I don't know either that it will happen. I think it'll happen to some people, but just look at the numbers of people who, again, what you were talking about earlier, I'm not putting on a mask. Nobody's telling me what to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I was talking to an old friend of mine, probably one of the people I know whom I have known longest in my life. And he lives in New York. Now he's a bit older than I am. So he's in his early 70s. I was talking to him, in fact, just before Rosh Hashanah on the phone. And of course, you talk to anybody and the pandemic comes up. And he said to me, I had it. And I said, really? And you're okay now? He said, yeah, he's got some lingering after effects, but he's clearly, he's not dead.
Right.
But we're talking. He's like, yeah, well, I think they're really exaggerating the dangers of this, because I'm not dead. And I don't want to wear a mask. And he said, I'm 72 years old. I'm tired of people telling me what to do.
Right.
And I said, but you're an Orthodox Jew. Again, at the fairly, ultra Orthodox is probably closer to it. I said, somebody's always telling you what to do. You don't do anything without asking some guy what you're supposed to do, and he tells you.
Yeah.
Because he's a rabbi. He's licensed, as it were. That's what a rabbi does. That's a rabbi's real job.
Which is why this podcast is called Not That Kind of Rabbi.
Yeah, it's not to make a speech or tell you the page number. It's not even.
No, but they look go to the Rebbe will, or the Beit Din, the court will decide, whatever it is.
Or any rabbi. I dropped, two drops of milk fell into the chicken soup as I was moving a thing over the pot. What do? Can I eat the soup? What do I do with the pot? Does the pot need to be re-koshered?
Right.
Can such a pot be koshered? Etc. And the rabbi will ask you the appropriate questions, which in this case, even I could give you, is what's the volume of soup to milk, etc., and he'll tell you what to do. I say,
but he doesn't want to wear a mask.
Yeah, I say, you do this for everything. I said, ask the rabbi, ask some rabbi if you should wear a mask. He said, well, some rabbis say yes, some rabbis say no. I said, yeah, but who gives you the authority to decide which rabbi you're going to go to?
Right.
If you're not a rabbi. But as long as that kind of, I don't feel like doing this because it makes me moderately uncomfortable. I will plug myself. A number of years ago, wrote a book called "How to Be a Mensch and Not a Schmuck." And one of the examples I give in the book is you're on your way. You're a good kid. You stay home all the time and you practice your violin and you do your homework while those bums are outside playing baseball in the vacant lot at the corner. You're on your way to the library one day with your overdue book, and there's 8 people there, and they're all like your basic group of, whatever, friends, classmates. There's 8 people there. They need a 9th person for that ball game, so they'll have a full team. Inside of classical Judaism, it's like you're in that position. It's not even a question. Unless not going to the library is going to cause you to lose your life or your livelihood forever, you are obliged to join that baseball game because nobody can play without you. And until people sort of realize that you're not the center of the universe. You're important, but you're no more important than anybody else. So as important as you are to yourself, the guy that you just called an asshole is just as important to himself, etc. And maybe he is an asshole, but you're never going to convince. You'll never convince him of that.
No,
so
there's
no point to argue.
And next Tuesday, in the middle of something, you'll be the asshole.
You'll be
that's part of being a human being.
It's like driving.
That's where forgiveness comes from. It's like your holiness is not the point of the exercise. Your humanness is the point of the exercise.
But it's like driving. Nobody can drive except for you. Right? Nobody else knows what the hell they're doing. Everybody knows this.
Eckhart Tolle, which I just reread because at first I dismissed him as sort of, he's just sort of watered down Buddhism. I get it. But I reread one of his books and there's some lovely things in there, and the power of what is, the isness of things, and how we refuse to accept the isness of things. Like we refuse to accept the science around the climate. We refuse to accept the science around the virus. But the virus doesn't care if we have an ideology. The climate doesn't care if we have an ideology. It's going to just play itself out. And we have to get ourselves in a position of humility to be able to position ourselves for the right action in what should be a surround of awe and wonder of what creation is. I got to go. I could talk to you forever, but I got to go.
Yeah.
Michael Wex is the author of many books, 7, or he's not sure if it's 8.
7, 8.
No, who knows? Rhapsody in Schmaltz, Born to Fetch, How to Be a Mensch, Not a Schmuck. All of them are well worth looking up and reading. Mr. Wex, what a pleasure to talk to you. I haven't spoken to you.
Ralph. It's fun. I haven't talked to you, as you just said. I haven't talked to you in a long time, but it was great.
I keep in touch.
Yeah, and you too.
And be safe. And I hope that you and yours are safe and well and have a sweet new year.
You also, and the same to you, Ralph, and to yours.
Thank you. I'm Ralph Ben-Mergy. This is Not That Kind of Rabbi. If you want to get in touch with me, you can do it through my website. I do spiritual counseling as well. I'm an ordained spiritual director, and I do counseling with people one-on-one and in groups. I do aging to saging workshops as well. My website is Kavanah, which is Hebrew for intention. What is your intention in this life? And it's spelled in this case, since it's in English, KAVANAH.ca. So you can go there if you're interested in any of that. And there's also a Facebook page for Not That Kind of Rabbi if you have comments or suggestions and people you'd like me to speak with. So you take care of yourselves and take care of each other. And we'll see you soon on Not That Kind of Rabbi. Bye-bye.
This podcast has been produced by TMDS and accelerated by Roam Phone. Roam Phone brings you the most reliable virtual phone service to run your business and protect your home number from unwanted calls. Visit roamphone.ca to get started.